Hello, everybody. I'll just give it another minute for everyone to arrive. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Janet Patterfung, and I'm the project manager for the Green Resilience Project. I will flag that I have a small child and a dog at home, and because life doesn't stop and start when we want it to, there may be some interruptions, so I apologize in advance. So for those who don't know, the Green Resilience Project took place across what is colonially known as Canada. We respect the sovereignty, laws, customs, and values of the many Indigenous peoples and communities on whose land our work was carried out. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, which is on the traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and Wendat peoples. I'm grateful to be here. I'm just going to let everyone know that we do have a French language interpretation option for those of you who are interested. Si vous souhaitez écouter ce webinaire en français, nous proposons un service traduction simultanée. Voici comment activer ce service. Si vous regardez en bas de votre écran Zoom, vous verrez un icône en forme de globe ou de planète pour l'interprétation. Cliquez sur cette icône et sélectionnez français. Aussi, assurez-vous de sélectionner l'option couper la version audio originale ou mute original audio si votre menu Zoom est en anglais, afin de n'entendre que la voix de notre interprète francophone. Thank you very much. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Green Resilience Project, we worked with local partner organizations and individuals in 33 communities across the country to host conversations on the links between climate change, income security, and community resilience. The project was funded in part by Environment and Climate Change Canada's Climate Action and Awareness Fund. Our community partners included environmental organizations, anti-poverty organizations, healthcare worker, a health policy researcher, Indigenous-led communities organizations, basic income pilot sites, a cultural organizer, 3 youth-focused organizations, a think tank, a community economic development organization, and a member-based farming organization. A range of urban, rural, and remote communities participated with representation in all provinces and territories, with the exception of Nunavut. We did have a partner in Nunavut, but they were unable to carry out an in-person conversation due to COVID-19. Our community partners were encouraged to invite participants from a wide range of backgrounds with focus on people impacted by climate change or other environmental issues, people living on low incomes, people with lived experience of poverty or houselessness, Indigenous and racialized people, people with disabilities or health challenges, people working in climate or income security advocacy, or people with livelihoods impacted by climate change or income insecurity. And today marks the launch of our report on what we heard in these conversations. The report will be available on our website, greenresilience.ca this afternoon. We'll send out a link to all of you tomorrow morning. And we'll upload a French language copy of the report as soon as it's ready. For our agenda today, we'll start with some remarks from a special guest who you may have just seen a sneak peek of. We'll then give some further background on the project, and then I'm going to hand it over to 2 of our volunteer steering committee members to talk about some of the findings and recommendations shared in our report. And then we're going to move on to a panel discussion with some of our project participants. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop any questions into the chat and we'll address them towards the end. So right now I would like to introduce our special guest, the Honourable Karina Gould, Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. Thank you, Minister Gould, for joining us today. I know that you're very busy and you are out and about in the world right now.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Janet, for having me. I'm really delighted to be here with you. Bon après-midi à tous et à toutes. And it's really wonderful to be here to celebrate the release of the Green Resilience Project's final report. I am joining you from land and surrounded by water, originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples who have traveled this area, now known as Windsor, Ontario, since time immemorial. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the Three Fires Confederacy consisting of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe peoples. I would also like to recognize Janet Patterfung, Sheila Regier, and Mitchell Beer for their exceptional work on this important project. Je salue votre détermination et votre dévouement à l'exploration des liens entre la résilience communautaire, la sécurité des revenus et le passage à une économie à faible émission de carbone. In September 2015, Canada and all UN member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. At the heart of the agenda are 17 goals that aim to address the world's most pressing social, economic, and environmental challenges. As the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development, I am Canada's federal government lead on domestic implementation of the 2030 Agenda. But reaching our goals requires not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society effort as well. That is why projects like this are so critical. The Green Resilience Project rightfully recognizes that a community's ability to meet, respond to, and recover from various challenges, including climate change and the shift to a greener economy, are tied to income security. Since 2015, we have delivered on real improvements to make life more affordable for Canadians, including making historic investments to build a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. And I'm so delighted that we now have all 13 provinces and territories signed on. We introduced the Canada Child Benefit. We increased the maximum guaranteed income supplement benefit for single seniors, and we increased the climate action incentive payments for Canadians in participating provinces. Au plus fort de la pandémie du COVID-19, les pertes d'emploi étaient les plus élevées pour ceux qui, dans bien des cas, pouvaient le moins se le permettre. Les travailleurs à faible salaire, les Canadiens racisés, les néo-Canadiens et les Autochtones. But despite the hardships that many Canadians have faced as a result of the pandemic, the 2020 Canadian Income Survey results, released a few weeks ago, showed that quick government action helped lift Canadians out of poverty when the pandemic could have pushed them to the brink. The survey found that about 1.4 million Canadians were lifted out of poverty in 2020 relative to the previous year. We know that some of this progress may be temporary, and there is much more work to be done, particularly when it comes to supporting Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and visible minorities. To protect our planet and build a stronger economy, we must do even more on climate action. Many communities want to take action on climate change, but feel under-equipped to do so. That is why I'm so anxious to read this report and learn about your perspectives on the ways in which income security policies can help build resilience and encourage local action on all the aspects of climate change. Your insights will be invaluable in ensuring we can move forward thoughtfully together. Merci beaucoup, miigwech. Thank you, and bonne journée.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Gould. Really, really appreciate you joining us here today and look forward to hearing your thoughts on our report. So before getting into a little bit more project background, I thought I would just start with some well-deserved thank yous. Firstly, a very sincere thank you to the community partners that took part in this project. It was an absolute honor to speak with all of you across the country. You all approached this project with so much thoughtfulness and creativity and passion, and we just really appreciate all of the hard work that you put into this. And thank you to the participants who took the time out of their day to take part in a community conversation and share your thoughts and ideas. Thank you to Environment and Climate Change Canada, who funded this project through the Climate Action and Awareness Fund in part. And thank you to our steering committee members. We have a wonderful volunteer group without whom this project would not have been possible. Mitchell Beer with the Energy Mix, Sheila Reguer and Pierre Stevens from Basic Income Canada Network, Susan Abels with Coalition Canada Basic Inco Revenue de Base, Dr. Jim Mulville, Dr. Rob Case, Nolan Wilson, Kendall David, and Kendra Down with Basic Income Canada Youth Network. And thank you to our fantastic staff team, our communications manager, Cecilia Stewart, our project assistant, Hannah Muhajirin, our engagement coordinator, Jessie Golem, and our Quebec outreach coordinator, Blandine Sebilo. And merci to our French language interpreter today, Marie Sigarois. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So I know we have many project partners and participants today who are joining us who are quite familiar with the project, but we also have some folks who may be less familiar. So I'll just give a quick explanation of what this is all about. So we are a group of volunteers and a small staff team who were assembled for the purpose of this project, and it was really born out of curiosity. The Green Resilience Project is really, it was formed to listen to what people have to say at this moment in time when climate change impacts are being felt, when the gap between rich and poor is widening, when more people are starting to name and recognize historical and current systemic racism, when we're facing an energy transition and a federal commitment to net zero emissions. We wanted to learn how the uncertainties brought on by climate change and income insecurity and inequality and discrimination overlap in the lives of people in Canada. And the project grew out of a few simple ideas that people rarely have time or space to think about climate change or carbon footprints when they're scrambling for rent or looking for work, that the most marginalized communities are often the hardest hit by economic disruption, climate chaos, or as we've seen, a global pandemic, that a sudden local climate disaster devastates incomes and health as well as the surrounding environment. And so we wanted to find out, are people aware of these links between climate change and income security? Are people aware of how climate change impacts different people differently? And what do they believe is needed in their own communities to weather this storm without leaving anyone behind? Um, and we understand that no one knows a community like the people living in it. So we partnered with individuals and organizations who could bring in a local perspective. So I'd also just like to make an important point about how this project was organized. We wanted to be careful not to tell people what to think or what the answers are. But we also understand that most local partners would be community organizers or nonprofit workers or volunteers who could likely benefit from capacity support beyond just funds. So we created resources like a script that could be used to guide the conversation. But knowing that our partners understood what we wanted to find out, because we worked with partners who were interested in having these conversations in their communities, our partners had the option of customizing the materials or not using the materials at all, or rewording the questions to better suit their local context. And the approach was the same for the conversation format. So, oh, excuse me, sorry. Wiener dog. So we provided a suggestion for the format, but partners decided for themselves what format would work best. So for some, it was virtual group events. For other, it was a kitchen table conversation. For some, it was a one-on-one interview. For many, it was a combination. And partners were given 4 questions to ask their participants, which they could reword. These questions were: how are changes to our community's environment and economy affecting you, your family, or the community as a whole? How are these environmental and economic changes related to each other? What are some possible solutions to the challenges that we've discussed that will help the community respond to climate change and create income security for all community members? This is my daughter, Max. And how do we think these solutions can be achieved to maintain or strengthen community resilience, and who's responsible? So then each community sent us a report on what was heard during their conversation. And in our final report, which you will receive, which is going to be uploaded to our site today, we've synthesized what we heard in all 33 conversations. And then based on what was heard, our project team has put together some recommendations to move forward. So each of the community reports will also be available on the website for those of you who'd like to dig a little deeper. And so with over 900 people speaking for 2 hours at least together about climate change, income security, and concerns about their own community's resilience. Okay, just give me a minute, buddy. We heard about a lot of things. There was a lot of ground covered. So the climate impacts being felt across the country, income insecurity concerns, problems and solutions related to food security, the right to affordable housing, mental health and eco-anxiety, transportation, sectors affected by climate change or the energy transition, like agriculture, ecotourism, oil and gas, fishing, systemic issues like the role of the capitalist colonial system in all of this, the need for decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty, the pitfalls of a cultural focus on individual success over collective success, the need for a wealth tax, the affordability of environmental choices, policy models like basic income and just transition, the role of government, like the need for local funding and agency, the need for better public engagement, the role of education, cooperation, activism, and intersectionality. So as you can tell, the content of these conversations was richly varied and truly remarkable and very insightful. The conversation materials that we sent out to our partners are publicly available, as I mentioned, and you can host one of these conversations in your own community if you'd like. We'll let you know where to find those after this webinar. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to two of our steering committee members to share some of the overall themes that we identified and the recommendations that we developed. So first, I would like to introduce our steering committee member and project lead, Mitchell Beer. So Mitchell is the publisher of The Energy Mix, a free thrice weekly e-digest on climate change, energy, and the shift off carbon, and a project lead for this project. So Mitchell, over to you.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you for joining us today, Max. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you could be here. I'm joining you today from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa. Before I jump into the themes that we identified in our report, I want to echo the thanks in all directions that you've just expressed, Janet, and maybe give some context for why it's just so incredibly exciting to see how this project has unfolded and to finally be at the point where we're actually launching the report out into the world. When I look back, and some of you on the webinar have heard this from us before, but when I look back, I realized more clearly in hindsight that we launched the Green Resilience Project on a series of bets where we could envision some powerful outcomes, but we didn't have the ability to guarantee them. We were in the first 6 months of the pandemic when this all started. The climate community was putting a lot of thought into what it would look like to build a just transition off fossil fuels that left no one behind. The basic income community was watching emergency relief programs that were proving some of the best arguments for a secure guaranteed income and proving them in real time. And we began to suspect that one way, maybe the best way to address two of the toughest problems facing our society was to address them together. We told ourselves, and we really meant it, as Janet said, that the purpose of our community conversations was to ask questions, not pitch answers. We thought that if the sessions contradicted or totally destroyed the assumptions that we brought into the project, that would be okay, as long as we learned something that moved both issues forward. So as I say, we were still making a number of bets. First of all, that people in communities would want to join the conversation, even in the midst of a pandemic, that local partners would want to work with us, that the project steering committee could bring together a dedicated superstar staff team who could hit the ground running and get a monumental amount of work done, get it done on time. And once again, in spite of all the restrictions and day-to-day challenges of a global pandemic. And then there was the even bigger bet that we knew we couldn't and shouldn't count on, that our assumptions about the connections between income security, climate safety, just transition, equity and justice, that those assumptions were broadly consistent with what we would hear back from a widely diverse group of hundreds of participants across Canada. Our report distills all of that knowledge and wisdom and experience into 4 themes. First, we're all increasingly exposed to climate impacts, but it's harder when you're also facing financial precarity. And the majority of participants in our conversations were living the impacts of climate change and income insecurity today. Many of them were interested in taking action in their own lives, in building resilience in their communities, but they couldn't do it without more time, more funding, more resources, and after the last 2 years, without getting past their own mental and emotional exhaustion. Second, people want to live in healthy, resilient communities that are prepared to face the climate crisis and the income security crisis. They're interested in solutions that make a real difference in day-to-day life. Things like affordable local food supplies, healthier housing that uses less energy, better transit, stronger local economies, services, and infrastructure. A great many of the things that make people's lives better can also help deliver the faster, deeper carbon cuts we so desperately need. So a big takeaway is that climate actions that put people and communities first are about opportunity and gain, not loss and pain. But our third theme shows what it'll take to tap into those opportunities. Many local participants were so skeptical that they could take action on climate change or income security because they have so much less influence on big structural systemic issues than corporations and governments. They didn't think governments were doing enough to address these problems, and they didn't think they could get the job done on their own. Several of our local partners reported a sense of hopelessness, apathy, or mistrust in the institutions that are supposed to keep us and our communities safe and well. As our partner in Sault Marie put it, it's not like we're lacking in the people wanting to make these changes. We just aren't the people who have the power to do it. And we heard that again and again and again in so many ways, in so many communities across the country. But the fourth theme was the equal and opposite of that. The communities are ready, eager, determined to step up, given the support and the resources to create the change we need. That sets up a challenge and an opportunity for governments to deliver the transformative policies to address the root causes of climate change and income security and inequality, and empower communities to take self-directed action. You can find more on these points in the full report, and I promise you a powerful and compelling read when you dig in. But I don't want to take any more of your time now, apart from thanking you again for joining this session and extending a huge set of over-the-top accolades to our participants, partners, staff, and steering committee. Janet?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mitchell. And now I'd like to introduce Sheila Reguer, our steering committee member and project lead. Sheila is a founding member of Basic Income Canada Network and former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Over to you, Sheila.
Thanks so much, Janet. So I'm coming to you from the same place as Janet. And as she said, it's the traditional territory of many nations, now home to many other nations, people from many other nations who have come to make Toronto their home and to make it one of the most diverse places in the world. It's great that one of our participants comes from this area too. I want to echo first, as Mitchell said, how grateful I am to all of the participants. But I want to say a special thank you to our funders and to Minister Gould for her encouraging remarks. I really do mean that, because I want them to know, I want our governments to know how important it is that they learn from this experience that you've all shared. We're facing a connected crisis in climate, in inequality, and now in democracy. The strength of democracies actually is a strong civil society and the capacity for people to be heard and to take care of each other. And that's what this report is all about. So I'm going to really, really briefly summarize the recommendations we've made. And these are the Green Resilience Team's recommendations. They're built on everything that we heard. And what we focused on was what we consider to be the greatest, most immediate, and the recommendations that can have lasting impact to empower positive transformations and resilience. They in turn make a whole lot of other brilliant solutions that partners have come up with. They make those other solutions possible. They create the conditions for hope, care, and collective flourishing. So that's the basis of these top four that we've identified. The first one is to incorporate basic income into Canada's plan for a just transition. So Canada's just transition needs proactive policies that enable everyone to thrive and contribute in working towards an equitable, low carbon future. What a basic income guarantee creates is the financial security that people need to support that and to support themselves and their families. For me, I think I've heard that some of the just transition perspectives seem to focus overly on getting every fossil fuel worker a clean energy job. What a basic income does is much more than that. It considers that perhaps that fossil fuel worker got into it because there was no other choice, and they would rather be a paramedic or a musician. They might be really good at something else, but didn't have the choice. Or you may have an office worker who is just tired of working inside and would rather transition to something that would help the green energy sector. What a basic income does is provide options for people to succeed. People want to support each other. They want to support their communities, but they need the capacity to do so. And we need to ensure that no one is left behind in this really rapid environmental and economic transition that we need. The second recommendation is designing income security and climate policy solutions to focus on improving individual and collective quality of life. So again, across communities, Mitchell mentioned this, people want to be part of the change that we need, but they're limited by time, money, structural barriers. So again, repeating Mitchell, these policy solutions must be framed in terms of opportunity and gain and not loss and pain. The third one is to empower people and communities with the tools and resources they need to build or strengthen resilience. Communities are experts in their own experience. I mean, we learned this from all of these conversations. They know what the solutions are, and they're the ones who should lead them with appropriate and accessible policy, funding, and other forms of government support. Another consistent message that we heard that comes out in this recommendation is that communities are not benefiting from the status quo, economically, socially, politically. That really needs to change. And in particular, given Canada's history, that change has to mean working towards decolonization and reconciliation for the harms inflicted by multiple institutional and individual actors. This includes implementing the calls for justice of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Self-determination in governments are key in all matters relating to or affecting Indigenous people. So this is critical, and Indigenous worldviews are critical to this process that guides all solutions. The last recommendation, ensure that corporations and the wealthy pay their fair share. I think the basis for this is an understanding that our recommendations are urgent and they are doable. The responsibility for that, however, needs to be placed on the right shoulders, not those who can least afford it. I love the way one of our partners from Quebec most succinctly put it. The people who have too little are not the problem. It's the people who have too much money and power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was wonderful. Thank you. So now we are going to begin our panel discussion. So if our panelists would like to turn their cameras on, we will follow up with a Q&A if anybody is interested in dropping any questions into the chat. So we have on our panel, we have Laurence Dubuc, who is a researcher activist at the School of Industrial Relations at the University of Montreal. Laurence, if you'd like to turn your camera on. Her work focuses on arts, labor, precarity, collective action, and public policy in the arts sector. Particularly since the beginning of the pandemic, Laurence has been at the forefront of strategic reflections dedicated to the building of public capacity in the arts, working collaboratively with a wide array of partners from across Canada. Laurence was a facilitator for the Arts and Cultural Workers Conversation hosted by Amanda Vintelli with participants across Canada, primarily in Quebec. Dale Eshelby, if you'd like to turn your camera on as well, Dale, grew up in rural Nova Scotia and returned to Lockport, Nova Scotia after close to 2 decades in research at McGill University. Dale is now a municipal councillor for the town of Lockport. As a town councillor, Dale was appointed the province's municipal representative on the Ministers' Roundtable for the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act and received the Lieutenant Governor's citation for community engagement. Dale is president of the Local Centre for Prosperity, which has partnered with the Green Resilience Project to host 2 conversations in Lockport, Nova Scotia. Josephine Gray, hi Joe, is a human rights organizer engaged in community development for 35 years. Joe is founding director of Food Share, the St. Jamestown Community Cooperative, Democracy Watch, and Project Esperance, a 111-unit building for domestic abuse survivors. Her work as an advocate and organizer has taken her to the UN, World Social Forums, and communities across 7 continents. Currently, she's on the board of the local food and farm co-op, Ontario, and is leading the development of the Oasis Food Hub pilot project for the St. Jamestown community. Joe, working with the St. Jamestown Community Co-op, partnered with the Green Resilience Project to host a conversation in St. Jamestown and Toronto. And we have Michelle Pruder. Michelle has worked as a community development officer with Community Futures North Central Development for over 15 years. Serving 17 communities in the north central region of Manitoba, Michelle loves both the land and its people and finds meaning in the projects she's been involved in. These include recycling and greenhouse projects, removing scrap metal from Nunavut and northern Manitoba, assisting in the management of constructing a seniors housing co-op in Thompson, and working with entrepreneurs in starting small home-based businesses in their community. Michelle, in her role with Community Futures North Central Development, partnered with the Green Resilience Project to host a virtual conversation with community members from Thompson, Churchill, and Waboden, Manitoba. So welcome. Thank you all for joining us. Michelle, I'm not sure if you're able to turn your camera on, or Laurence. So my first question is for all of our panelists, and you can pick and choose if you'd like to be the first to start. Maybe Joe, since you're right there front and center, we'll start with you. My first question is, why was it important to have a conversation about the links between climate change and income security with your community?
Well, we've been working towards a sustainable, full cycle climate resilient food hub project for about 9 years now. And one of the things that we constantly encounter as a barrier is people's lack of time to engage. And the fact that people are in a continual struggle just for the basic needs of life makes it incredibly difficult for people to be able to sustain their involvement. And although we have many highly educated new Canadians in our community who have a great deal of potential to offer, they're constantly struggling to make ends meet. And we became very aware of the issue of time and the lack of time as we've been working through this effort. And, we'd had some discussions about time banking and the like, but we wanted very much to involve our community in a discussion about basic income as a larger systemic solution to these barriers that we face in our neighborhood.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, when you first told me about that, it really resonated that time is such a barrier to participating in our communities. Michelle, I have you next on my screen. So would you like to answer our question about why it was important to have this conversation in your community?
Yeah, I think so. As mentioned in the bio that you said about me, we serve 17 communities through our organization. So 2 of those communities had approached us and really wanted to participate. And I think for a lot of people, we're feeling the effects of climate change and we're just watching and not knowing what to do, and these effects are especially, well, maybe I'm biased, but in the north, we're really seeing those things happening. And, people rely on their winter roads for being able to get all the fuel in for the year, to get a lot of the food in for the year, all your supplies that you'll need for any construction over the summer. And that those winter roads, the amount of time that they're open is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and one of our communities is Churchill, which is on the Hudson Bay, and they've been watching, the effects on the polar bears and on the beluga whales, and they rely almost completely on tourism, and the effects of that have really impacted them, or have the potential to really impact them. There's a lot of fear. And I think just when they heard about the conversation, they had so much to say. So I think it was just really important to have that place where people could come and just talk and get this out and feel like, okay, we haven't done a lot, but here's a first step.
Yeah, these fears can weigh heavily on our minds. Laurence, I have you next on my screen.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. It's an honor to participate in this conversation with such amazing speakers. Just for a bit of context, the community I'm representing are Francophone and Anglophone artists and cultural workers, most of whom reside in Quebec, but we did have some participants from Ontario and Alberta too. I see many reasons why it was important to have this conversation with our community. Obviously, the first one is that artists and cultural workers are amongst the most precarious workers. So it felt very important to have representation from precarious categories of workers. Artists have low income, they have very difficult access to social protection, they have irregular work, and in many ways their work resembles other types of gig workers. So we all know also that the pandemic has exacerbated this situation. The art sector has been amongst the most impacted by the pandemic, if you look either at income levels or at the number of hours worked per week. So obviously, as it was mentioned previously, if you have to work 2 to 3 jobs to make a living, if in addition to this you have to care for kids or for a family member, then it makes it very, very difficult to engage with climate action. It affects how you are affected by these structural issues, but it also affects how you respond to it. And while artists are aware that they might be contributing, often despite themselves, to a culture that encourages hyper-productivity, both in material and immaterial terms, international travels, international shipping, and sometimes having to do all these networking, relationship building with institutions and maybe powerful individuals that have ties to dirty industries. They also have been historically actors of social change. And if you look at contemporary social movements, if you look at Black Lives Matter, if you look at Extinction Rebellion, decolonization and feminist movements, and if you look at more localized struggles in Toronto, for instance, around housing rights against encampment eviction, you will see that artists are actively taking part in those. So we know that while they're political actors, we also know that their precariousness is a major threat to maintaining the type of intensity and the level of mobilization that we need to sustain in order to provoke transformative change and change within society. So in terms of sectoral learning, I think that this conversation was very, very important.
Yeah, artists make such important contributions and there are so many barriers. Dale, why was it important to have this conversation in Lockport?
Well, I'll tell you, but first I have to say thank you so much for allowing all of us to be part of this critically important work, and to the team and everything that's been achieved. It has been a real privilege to be here. So I'm talking to you from a town called Lockport, tiny town, less than 550 people on the South Shore of Nova Scotia. And it was critical to have this conversation with folks from our town for mainly 4 reasons, okay? First of all, 80% of Lockport is, both its land mass and its population is on Locks Island. And we're adjoined to the mainland by a beachfront causeway. So our very existence is threatened by sea level rise. Second thing is that Lockporters are dependent on the ocean and its spin-off industries. The main one is lobster, okay? And warming ocean temperatures are actually causing the lobsters to migrate north. Our financial lifeblood is moving. Then the third thing that we have to think about is that we don't know enough about basic universal income and the transition from a carbon economy. So these were critically important. But another thing is that these threats that we face and the lack of knowledge that we have are just too overbearing. They're too overbearing to talk about. And so we don't talk about them enough. So that's a critical reason to have these conversations. What we've talked about will hopefully lead to a whole bunch of positive solutions and steps forward, ways to protect ourselves and our community. And it's very interesting. Communities in northern Newfoundland, when they were threatened by a dwindling population and a lack of resources, some of these communities were relocated. And it is my belief that relocating a community destroys the social fabric and all the connections and eliminates the history which has bound the people together and supported their well-being and their mental health. So it's critically important, being such a small community on such a small island, completely surrounded by water, that we start thinking about ways that we can make our community a healthier one, rather than just giving up and saying, okay, we need to move.
I'm so glad, Dale, that you decided to champion this conversation, given these potentially catastrophic effects that your community is facing. My next question is for all panelists again. And so with this one, the conversation participants were asked to discuss links between climate change and income security. And so I'm wondering if you have any key takeaways from your conversations that you'd like to share. And so we'll go in a slightly different order this time. Maybe Michelle, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. I think two key things kept coming up. One was that people's livelihoods are at risk, right? So they don't feel secure. They don't feel financially secure. And the reason that their livelihoods are at risk is due to some of the climate change, right? And how it's impacting them. In addition to their livelihoods being at risk, there's this increased cost of living. And, you know, like just even things like to do with insurance. You know, one participant brought up how insurance rates are rising because there's more things happening, right? Like stronger winds are ripping off roofs and whatever it might be, right? So those were sort of the two things that were linked, you know, just cost of living rising, livelihoods being at risk, and climate's changing. What are we going to do about it? You know, we can't control the climate. So that was kind of how our discussion went from there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we definitely heard a lot of that. Laurence, would you like to address this question?
Sure, thank you. I think that Michelle covered a lot of similar reflections that were made in the arts and culture conversation. But if I can just bring up a few points, I think that during the conversation, I cannot highlight this enough, that the participants were very much aware of the fact that the consequences of climate change are affecting certain categories of individuals more than others. Historically marginalized groups like racialized artists, artists living with a disability, Indigenous artists and communities. And I think that we heard a lot about the fact that making changes and more ethical choices are inaccessible to many. And there was the sentiment, the feeling that it was very hard to concretely change your habits to reflect these green ethics that for some participants was also classist. Like we're talking a lot about buying biological fair trade food, boycotting certain institutions. And some artists were saying like, but I cannot afford to go shop elsewhere than Walmart, you know? And I think that another point that I thought was very important, especially if you make a connection with the basic income, is because of the impoverishment. And because of a lack of structural collective change, many artists said that they were forced to downscale and consume less, not necessarily because of choice or not necessarily motivated by environmental concerns. And to me, it's very obvious that limited social and economic mobility are impacting mental health. It's increasing anxiety, stress levels, it's lowering self-esteem. And so income insecurity has a really deep impact on the artist's perceptions of their power to engage with this work. And this feeling of individual powerlessness shapes in a very important way the current and the future modes of being and acting. And just to conclude, I think that we have to be very careful in the arts and culture sector about the fact that the impoverishment of many means that a lot of artists are actually undertaking an undesired career transition outside of the arts and culture. And this existential threat has to be seen as further contributing to the climate change crisis because it's preventing arts-based tools and arts-based methodologies to flourish. And these are very important channels allowing the dissemination of information outside of traditional mainstream media.
Definitely, that's a loss for all of us. Joe, what did you hear in your community?
Well, there's a whole range of impacts that climate change is having on us. I mean, we are an incredibly densely populated neighborhood. We are, 18 times denser than the rest of the city. And we have 25,000 people in a city block in all these high-rise towers. And these towers are aging, they're in poor condition. And when sometimes there's weather shocks, the buildings shut down, and then the people who have to find somewhere to go, if they can even get out, they don't have the money to be able to make choices as to where they can go. So they end up being dispersed into buses and shelters and community centers. There's a big issue with accessing healthy food. We see that the supply lines of food are being interrupted in so many ways by climate change, and people from around the world living in our neighborhood are already painfully aware of the impact of climate chaos on healthy food production and being able to afford it. So for most of our residents, we find that we don't have access to healthy food. So it's a big struggle to try to get any kind of healthy food into the neighborhood, and there's very little space. And the spaces that are there are in very poor condition. And there's just been no real attention paid or investment made in this neighborhood to try to address these issues. So the fact that people have, they're struggling to cover their rent, they often have very crowded apartments. They had during COVID, there was a lot of despair, there was a lot of fear. We saw overdose deaths increase by 167%. We saw a lot of increase in suicides and the like. So there's been a lot of very painful impacts in our neighborhood. And the fact that people don't have the income security to be able to make good choices, they don't have the time to be able to invest their knowledge, their experience, their education in developing solutions. All of these things sort of compound the sense of insecurity and vulnerability to climate change. And it's really sad because so many people have come here to take refuge from climate chaos because of what happened to their home countries. And then they find themselves still vulnerable and in very challenging situations, very, very difficult for them to integrate into Canadian society and be able to contribute to the kinds of changes we need to see happening. And yet they have so much awareness and so much potential. So we really thought a lot about, how we really need to have enough stability and enough ability to make choices to be able to, for one thing, change the way we consume, but also change the way we deal with our resources, with our organic waste and the like. And we need to be able to support our families better, have healthier children, and a family with one computer in lockdown COVID school. There were a lot of serious family breakdown issues that occurred. So, underlying all of it is always this issue of being able just to know that you have enough income to cover your basic needs and make, wise choices in how we can build our community together. And the frustration is very high and the despair is very high. So it was a difficult conversation, but very worthwhile to have. And I think this conversation helped to get people thinking about potential solutions and realize that we're not alone.
Yeah, the despair and frustration must be incredibly high. I remember talking to you in the summer and there was a heat wave and you'd been waiting like 2 weeks to get access to an outdoor faucet for people to cool down. Dale, what did you hear in Lockport?
Well, it's really interesting. I have to tell you first that we were lucky enough to have 3 types of conversations. First 2 were mainly with adults. They were in-person, intimate, small in-person conversations. And we had some virtual conversations. These were with adults, but in the in-person conversations, we actually had a range of participants that spanned from 10 to 100 years old. And then we had the third type of conversation that we had was a high school conversation where we went in and spoke with all the senior high students in our high school that were not out lobster fishing because that was the first day of the lobster season. So what we found that the links between climate change and income security, and particularly the universal basic income, even after we explained it, were still a bit foreign and almost incomprehensible to some adults. Mind you, it was fascinating. The students understood. So we spoke to a lot of people who weren't exposed to those concepts and the idea of a transition economy. And we realized that it was incredibly important that we had more education and more conversations. And it was also interesting, the virtual conversations that we had were people who had a connection to Lockport, but were elsewhere. So people that had come from away and bought property here, or people who had done their secondary education here and had gone away. And this group of people actually had a very strong consensus about the ideas of a basic universal basic income. And with these guys, we got to move into much more deep ideas and solutions. And so that was definitely interesting. And as I said, there was less consensus in the in-person conversations, and there was a varying amount of understanding and opinions, and there was less of a link between the concepts. So that told us that if we want to move this forward for this area, we need to make sure it's the ideas and the links are much stronger. And some people who thought that a basic universal income was actually like the CERB, and they were afraid that if people got it, they wouldn't work, and that it would cost more in taxes. So again, it points to a greater need for education. But one of the most compelling aspects was that the students' ability to integrate and contextualize the information we provided in the presentations and in the videos. It was really exciting. They came up with thoughtful, concrete recommendations, and they had an impressive degree of consensus regarding the causes of the challenges and the solutions that were required to mitigate the output. So this was a terribly exciting thing for us. So what we came away with is that we just need to have more and deeper conversations, and we have to make the concepts more known. We have to broaden what we already know. We need to build on it.
Yeah, I remember when I read your youth report thinking the kids are going to be okay. They've got it. They understand what's going on.
Absolutely.
Our next question is what kinds of solutions you heard and who's responsible? Dale, since you've been talking about that a little bit already, did you have, would you like to say anything more about the solutions that people talked about?
Well, sure. When it came to who's responsible, government, okay, was what we heard again and again and again. And that also included a town council. So what can we do right here locally and then through the levels of government? But this was also balanced by the recognition that everybody, including the youth, have an important part to play. So we were looking to see what more projects, what more initiatives can we get started that we can get people engaged and do things with hands-on right here in the community. And what we heard again and again is people need to step up, right? Every citizen, every community. And the kids were saying, look, we can help fix this, right? And they were saying, well, we need to get into government. We need more younger people in government. And if we were to do that, we could pull in more potential players, and we can even make big companies. We have a large seafood processor here. We can make the bigger companies recognize that they have a much larger responsibility and they can contribute to activities large and small that we can do right here at home.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Laurence, I saw you nodding your head. Would you like to talk about solutions that came up in your conversation and who's responsible?
Sure. It was brought up during the conversation that the participants thought that it was essential for all actors and all sectors to act and cooperate proportionally to their capacity and to their level of power. We're talking about civil society, communities, governments, businesses, organizations. But just like Dale, the participants believe that the federal government ought to be primarily responsible for addressing climate change, because they believe that the government was the federal government was the most well-positioned to implement policies that would protect the commons and that could be implemented on a larger scale basis. I think that we need to reflect more on how our democracy is functioning too, like who is the government accountable to ultimately. This is a big question if you're talking about a just transition model. I know we'll be talking about it a bit later. Amongst the solution that we heard an electoral system reform, a universal basic income. A UBI is a policy solution that is very popular in the arts and cultural sector. Guaranteed housing for all, increased funding for essential services and care work, more collaboration between Indigenous peoples and settlers that would center and amplify Indigenous voices, sovereignty, and self-determination. More investments in environmental, social, and healing-centered education. Increased taxes for the wealthy individuals and corporations, institute a carbon tax, and more funding for the arts and cultural sector. And right now, having worked with a lot of policy actors recently in the arts and cultural sector, there are reflections that are being had around who gets this funding. The fact that historically cultural policy has encouraged a very modern, white, elitist figure of the artist. And amongst these community conversations that we've been having, there was a lot of artists that were saying, you know, every artist who is actually involved in community arts, who are trying to who are trying to help a youth, marginalized youth, who are working with artists with disabilities. Like all these artists are actually not even eligible for public funding. All right. So these are reflections that are actually currently being had. And I think that the participants in our conversations also argued that the environmental impact of cultural projects should be assessed upon receiving public funding, so that change is not merely voluntary, but also mandatory.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you. Joe, would you like to talk about any of the solutions and who's responsible that you heard in your community conversation? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I think we, I support what was said already. We did look at the responsibility of government to work more in a more enabling way with vulnerable communities. We find that, we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience and a lot of great ideas, but, there's this sort of systemic classism and racism that keeps us out of the kinds of resources that would be required to make the changes we need. We know that a lot needs to happen in the food system. We know that a lot of people bring a lot of knowledge and wisdom towards what needs to change in the food system, and yet the corporate stranglehold on that system is very powerful. So there's a lot of different ways in which government needs to get involved if they're going to be addressing the most pressing issues of climate chaos. And we also like to call it climate chaos because we think change is a very benign term, and the effects that it has on our community is more chaos. It has more to do with unpredictability, when you don't know what's going to happen to a particular crop, or you don't know what's going to happen to a building because of extreme weather events and things like that. We have a lot of concern about emergency preparedness in our neighborhood. We feel that this is a area that is lacking, and that for communities to be well set and prepared for emergencies, to be able to help their neighbors, to be able to help themselves, that we're going to need some regulatory changes, some zoning changes. For us, we have some very solid proposals for improving our resilience, and yet we can't get past the barriers created by zoning and building permits and things like that. So the need for local governments to work more closely and more collaboratively with communities is a very big issue for us. But also, of course, that if people can't afford to be involved in community actions, in building co-ops, in helping to create a more sustainable and healthy food system, then it's all talk. So a basic income is obviously a key strategy to being able to free up the ingenuity and the capacity and the abilities of people in communities to do the work that needs to be done. So we saw really a necessity for governments to start working together across different levels to combine our resources, actually our taxes, to be able to wisely invest in sustainable solutions. Because we see, for instance, at the City of Toronto, there's a lot of policy talk and a lot of policy goals, but they don't get activated. They don't actually turn into reality. And part of that is a lack of financing that the province could be putting in, or the federal government could be putting in. And these separations in governments not collaborating is causing a lot of problems, causing a lot of inertia and nothing happening. So there was, I agree with this notion that we have to have a lot more engagement between civil society and the civil service. And we need to have a lot more innovation and support for innovation. And we need to have more respect for the people who are actually the actors within communities, giving them the spaces and the time and the resources and the livelihoods to be able to dedicate to creating these kinds of solutions. So yeah, it's a very wide,
Yes.
obviously wide-ranging set of things that need to happen, but
yeah, and as you
conversations
say,
like this should make it better, I hope.
yeah, And it takes time to do these things, and people need compensation for their time in order to pay rent.
Yeah.
Michelle, what did you hear?
Well, a lot of it was the same as what's already been talked about, and especially when it comes to the bigger, government responsibilities, and we need to have funding, to have project managers or people who can kind of oversee continuing this work, right? But there were some small solutions too that our group came up with, and some of them were simple things like recycling. And recycling might seem like oh yeah, of course, everybody recycles and it's easy to do, but our communities face the challenge of how do you get it out of your community? It's one thing to collect it, but the cost to ship or put on a train, the recycling, because there's no roads going into certain communities, it's exorbitant, and it doesn't make it worth, like there's just not the money to be able to run successful recycling programs. So how can things become more local? Can you create new products out of recyclables right in your community? Or how can you have a more local economy? And food really was a big one as well, because again, you've probably heard stories about, people living up north, way up north, so it's so expensive. And it truly is. Like Churchill is a very expensive place, and, Nunavut even more so, because everything has to be flown in. And one of the great examples in Churchill is that they have a greenhouse. It's called Rocket Greens, and it's a year-round greenhouse. And they produce for the northern store is where they can sell a lot of these greens. So when I've been in Churchill, it's exciting to be able to go into a store and it's like, oh, there's, fresh grown spinach. Like this is just picked today. And it's minus 45 degrees outside. But they really talked about normalizing eating foods that are in season, that are more local, having that educational component, and teaching youth about, even with employment, like youth have to go so far, like they have to leave their communities to go and get, that college degree or whatever. And it's either that or stay home and there's no employment at home. Or, they just felt like we need to talk to our kids. We need to change the way we've been doing things. And, they really brought up the big companies, big corporations. They need to do their part. And one thing that's already been said too is that having more income security gives people those options, instead of, as soon as a big business comes into town, wants to start something that, even though it's going to harm the environment, it's going to hurt the whales, it's going to do whatever, you feel compelled to take it because it's going to provide jobs, right? So having some income security, or that basic income, gives people options and that ability to think a little more clearly about, is this really good for our community or not?
That is so interesting. Yeah. Not making decisions out of desperation.
Mm-hmm.
So I just have two questions left. So my first one is, there were two policy models that were part of the script that we provided that some communities use and some didn't. And so I just wanted to see if any of our panelists would like to make any further comments about anything they might have heard about just transition or basic income. Would any of you like to comment on that? Yes, Laurence?
Yes, maybe about the UBI, because like I said, it's a very popular policy solution in the arts. I think that during the conversation, it was very interesting because the participants agreed, most of them agreed that a UBI would be a necessary starting point, but not the solution. Because a UBI can definitely play a role in leveling inequities and enabling more people to contribute to the transition. But it does not fundamentally tackle the root cause for widespread income insecurity and an equitable distribution of resources, which are the result of inequitable power relations due to colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. So you don't want a UBI to become a subsidy to capitalism. It needs to be designed in a certain way. I know that some people talked about it in the chat, but it's true that it needs to be sufficient to allow, it needs to be a livable income. So not just like $300 or $400. And I think that in my own research, I've been getting more and more interested in learning about how other welfare states are actually approaching this problem. And we know that Canada is more of like a liberal tradition. But in other welfare states, such as France, for instance, that is another tradition. They're more focused on the fact that there is a growing consensus that we need, yes, a general economic guarantee, but we also need more democracy at work. These two things have to go together. You cannot just focus on a UBI. And in France, there's the economist and sociologist Bernard Friot, who's very well known, who has worked for decades on the concept of salaire à vie, or lifelong salary. And here we're talking about a much more radical anti-capitalist project, giving every citizen a political right to live in dignity by obtaining an economic guarantee, but also taking back control over their institutions. So I thought that this was a very interesting way that we can maybe confront different policy models around economic income security. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dale, I see your hand up. We'll go Dale and then Joe.
Well, I'd like to share with you some of the perspectives that came from the students. And they're such down-to-earth, doable actions that they're the sort of thing that we need to pick up on. And they're saying that in order to move forward the idea of a universal basic income and the transition off of carbon-based economy, they said we have to speak up and we have to engage in public protest and debates and political action. This is what the students are saying that they need to do. And you know, they said that in order that there has to be a focus on actually taxation. I was amazed hearing this from kids, right? And they're saying that there has to be a way to fund the transition. And the kids said, well, tax the rich and the big organizations. And I think that's something that we all know, that there has to be a more equitable way of taxing the taxing the people that need to pay the taxes, right? If you've got, and particularly the kids were saying, look, the industries that are having the biggest income, the biggest impact on our climate are the people that we need to be taxing the most. And that just makes such you know, easy sense that there are things that we all realize, but sometimes we need to hear it come from the mouth of babes, right? But they also said that they think that the UBI is a great system for the fishers, because the fishermen here it's a seasonal occupation. And if there was a basic, universal basic income, the fishing community could spend more of their time, invest more of their time on working on transitional ideas and green you know, green work. So they said, if we're going to increase diversity in our town's basic income, we have to look at what we have. One of the riches that we have is our actual location. And they're saying that, well, the kids said, look, let's build an eco resort. Let's promote eco-terrorism. Let's
Tourism.
Let's make sure that we're using our ocean for more recreational things. Make sure that one of our big concerns is, how do we get access to and from the island? If our causeway is breached by a storm surge, all of our services are cut off. So the kids are saying, well, why don't we look into a hydro-powered ferry? Something that can be used for residents and used for tourists as well. They're also saying, well, we need government supports, and some of the things that governments could be supporting would be helping us open more businesses or reuse some of our buildings that are empty at the moment. They're saying, like, let's make sure the government helps actually people make the transition, make the job transition. They're saying, let's make sure we've got better use of our community programs and our riches and our knowledge that exists in our community right now. And they said, well, why don't we create a nature preserve? Things like this that will make us a more interesting and a richer location, and help with biodiversity and with giving back to our environment. So the kids had a lot of great ideas, and it was really exciting. And they understood the idea of transitioning, and they understood the idea of a basic income. It was very, it was very exciting.
That's wonderful. Joe?
I just wanted to mention that, quite a few of the folks in my community are quite aware of human rights treaties. And, Canada has had this glowing reputation in the past as a leader in human rights. And yet we seem to have forgotten that these are inherent treaty rights that Canada signed and ratified that would support shifting our government's directions away from feeding the corporate sector as we do now, back to responding and interacting with for the common good with our population. And I think, exercising human rights, be they economic and social rights, eco rights, the rights of the child to a healthy, livable future, the rights of artists, scientists to benefit from their work. There are so many rights that we Canadians tend not to be aware of, that we could consider using legal strategies to try to secure these rights. And this would then help the government have the tools it requires to be able to make these shifts, because they tend to be very stuck in this paradigm of the banking system and the debt system and corporate control and corporate domination. And if we can decorporatize our economy and our society by utilizing our human rights treaties and principles, this would be one important way to move forward. And I think, as was mentioned earlier about reconciliation for the Indigenous peoples, there's also the issues of people of African descent. We have the most diverse diaspora of people of African descent. And there's lots of talk about reparations or about some form of restoring equity, recognizing that the systemic impact has been extremely disproportionate, as we could see through COVID and by other effects. But, actual solutions that engage and involve people of African descent are still far and few between. And there's, again, lots of talk, but no space, no investment. So I feel like the basic income is one of the key strategies that can start to level the playing field and start to restore a sense of equity, but also gives us the room to maneuver to be able to really push and engage our governments and our communities in activating and fulfilling human rights as interdependent, indivisible rights that are required for us to have thriving communities. And I think once people understand that these are, in fact, our lawful inheritance, that this is something that all governments have a duty to actually fulfill, this, I think, helps to change the conversation. And I think in our neighborhood, there's quite a lot of folks who have this awareness around universal human rights. And I hope that that becomes part of our strategy moving forward as we try to engage a basic income policy that is in fact respectful of human rights and doesn't become a tool for controlling people's behavior and further benefiting the corporate sector, because I think that's a big fear that a lot of people have. So I think making sure that human rights are always ever present as part of our strategies as we try to engage our governments with working towards a sustainable future in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You know, these are key tools that we can't afford to overlook.
That's such an important distinction, Joe. Thank you for bringing that up. We're getting close to time, so I have one last question for everyone. Maybe keep it into sort of a 2-minute response if you can. In your opinion, where do we go from here? Michelle, let's start with you.
Well, I think what our group kind of decided is we want to keep the conversation going, at least, you know, for now, that even though we don't see any big things we can do, let's keep updated on where this project is at. Let's keep our eyes open for any funding available, you know, that we could get that person in place, you know, a project manager or somebody who could be that lead to continue this work. So that's kind of where we left it.
Okay, that's important. Laurence, where do you think we go from here?
I think we need more activism of every type: direct actions, artistic interventions, protests, lobbying, political organizing, but we also need more education. We've been talking a lot about this today, but this is one of the points that were brought up during our conversations, the fact that there was a somewhat low literacy level when it comes to climate action, climate change. So more education. I think that on a personal level, I can say that the majority of the institutions I've been either studying or working with in the art sector recently, they've been more closely looking at how they can amplify research on the intersection of the arts and the environment, and the many other ways that they can engage with this work. So it does feel encouraging. About the community conversation more specifically, there is an intention to organize a follow-up meeting in the following months because the participants have expressed an interest to do so. Amanda Vincelli, who was the independent community partner who put this conversation together, she's also creating visual assets from the key takeaways from the discussions, so we can actually share them, leverage them in all of the participants' communities and network. And finally, we've created a database of resources, including information about the initiatives that we discussed and what was shared during the conversation by the participants.
Thank you. Dale, where do you think we go from here? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm loving what I'm hearing, and many of the things that our 3 different groups brought up have been mentioned. So of course it's find the funding to hire a point person who can keep things going. They're saying that we have a number of plans, and the idea of getting the data together is fantastic. So let's revamp and remodernize the plans that we have already, make sure that they're living plans. And everybody that we talked to wanted to keep the dialogue going. So how do we find a way to do that? And the Center for Local Prosperity was the partner in this, and they started a group called the Future Proofing Lockport Group. And with COVID, that seemed to have just sort of slowed down to a halt. And so one of the things that we can do is get that group going again. And another thing is, they said, let's partner with neighboring communities. So we're a rural area, and all of our communities are facing similar things. So why are we working on it alone? Let's partner with the people that are nearest to us.
I love it. I love it. And Joe, where do you think we need to go from here?
I think we need to continue the great work that's been happening around the basic income, but it also to make these connections between the just transition, green transition, and make those connections more explicit, and really put more and more attention and energy into helping people understand the many solutions that are possible, not only possible, but that are inherently our right. And I think one of the things I hope we can revive, as Dale was talking about and others, is this understanding and recognition that the people who are elected to represent us are being paid by us to serve our interests. And we seem to have forgotten as a society that government is not some strange alien hive mind. It is actually an engine, a construct that we invest in. And we need to make sure that we remember that its duty is to work with us and listen to us and make these changes possible. So engaging our local elected representatives more fully and more assertively, like reminding them what their duty is, reminding them that we've hired them, we pay them, they have a job, and their job is to make sure that their governments are supporting and assisting and enabling communities' ability to cultivate solutions. And where necessary and when possible, if we need to take these things to court in order to be able to push back on the power of corporate domination, then this is another strategy I think we shouldn't overlook, because we do have a lot of evidence and a lot of urgent need to make sure the government understands that it is our lawful right to thrive. It is our lawful right to have our needs met. It is our lawful right to have a sustainable future. It's not just a nice idea.
Yeah,
So
I think I forget that sometimes.
yeah, if we take this to court, maybe that's something we also need to do.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to have a brief Q&A. So Mitchell Beer and Sheila Reguer, if you guys would like to join us. We've had a couple questions come in. The first one has asked if the conversation groups were mainly female, or if there was good representation of males. I think I know why that question might have been asked. There were both. There were all genders represented as far as we know. We didn't collect specific demographic data for every single question or every single conversation, because we wanted the conversations to remain accessible. However, in our report, there is a snapshot of every conversation to give you an idea of who attended and where the communities took place and what pressing issues those communities were facing. I have one question here, and I'm thinking maybe Mitchell, this might be a question for you, which is, what impact could all of this have on climate policy?
Thanks, Janet. That really goes back to one of those bets or assumptions that I referred to earlier, because coming from the climate side of the house as opposed to the basic income side of the house, one of the things we kept seeing, that I think we're still seeing, is that when the conversation is about a just transition off fossil fuels, it's easy for me sitting here in Ottawa to talk or think or imagine what a just transition might look like in a place like Hinton, where we had Hinton, Alberta, where one of our partners hosted a conversation, or in Estevan, Saskatchewan, that's about 26% directly dependent on fossil fuel employment as a few years ago. And it's easy to theorize from here. There's a lot of really good hard work going on in the climate community about how that actually works in real life. And it's work between the climate community, the trade union movement, with communities, with right across the intersection of groups. And yet, when it's your job that everybody's talking about, of course you're terrified. And any of us would be. You know, one of the conversations I've heard from others that I really appreciate is, if we could put ourselves in some imaginary universe the one the fossil executives want to inhabit, where fossil fuels are benign. And I'm not saying they are, okay, but if we were there. But it turned out that the thing that fried the planet when used as directed was when you manufactured or built an automobile. Directly, not indirectly. So at that point, the focal point of the just transition was on Ontario and Quebec, not on Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. Would we be in any less of a state about somebody coming from away to tell us that our economy has to change? And what a lot of us have been thinking is that if there were some way of getting at that income insecurity and that worry about what's next and that lack of confidence and trust that we heard over and over again from all of the communities, most of the communities, about whether there's a safety net worth talking about, whether it's real, whether you can count on it, when it's your livelihood that's at stake. If there were a way of dealing with that, then the conversation to the just transition would work better, would be more inclusive, would give people a stake. And so I really think that is the first and most immediate benefit to this intersection we've been building, this conversation we've been building about the connections between climate and a basic income. As others have said better than I'm saying it right now in the course of this webinar, it gives people a chance to participate. It gives people some breathing room. It gives people some time to think. And any of us who've been there can identify with that state when, no, you know what, it's been another 18-hour day. This is the 14th in a row. I just don't have capacity for this conversation right now. Something else just quickly that came to us along the way was that this, and I don't remember this being a part of our initial conversations, but the same applies to a community that is either facing the immediate risk of climate disaster like Lockport, or a place that's right in the middle of it right now. You know, and of course, we all think of it in BC burning to the ground. And when you're in that moment, you're not thinking about whether, and I've never been there, so I'm speaking for somebody else's experience here. But when you're in that moment, I have to think that you are not thinking about the extent to which this was or was not caused by the climate emergency. You're not thinking about the carbon footprint of all of those things burning. You want to make sure your family is all safe and in one place. You'd like to know that your pets are alive. You're curious, worried to death about whether you still have a job because that burned down too. And you want to know how badly you're going to be done out of your insurance claim. So again, some modicum of income security that people can count on and believe is actually real enables so much else that people need to be able to talk about, think about, and work together on.
Thank you, Mitchell. We're a couple of minutes over. We're just going to take a couple more minutes. I have a question here that I'll direct to Sheila as the co-chair of the Basic Income Canada Network, which is what's next for the basic income movement. And then after that question, we'll conclude our webinar for today.
So with only a couple of minutes left, I'm going to answer this through Diane Beckett's question in the chat, where she talks about the assault on basic income lately. If people don't know this, following the Freedom Convoy and all of the disruption that caused to Ottawa and other places, the next target a lot of those people seemed to pick was basic income, especially in the form of Senator Kim Pate's bill in the House. And in talking to some of the politicians who are very supportive of basic income, their response was basically that if the right-wing conspiracy, fear-mongering, white supremacist faction thinks this is a really bad idea, it's probably a really, really good idea for democracy and for all the rest of us. And if they're fighting us that hard, it must mean we're winning something. So I think we just need to keep winning. And I love all of the ideas that people have had and the growing partnerships across artists, women's organizations, environmental organizations, income security groups. All of this, I think, just, you know, building more and more towards a unified presence to make sure that we do win.
Exactly. Thank you. That's a silver lining. So at this point, we're going to call it a day for our webinar. I really hope you'll read the report. It will be up on our site later today, greenresilience.ca. We will send out the link to everyone. We'll also include in there a link to where you can find our conversation materials if you'd like to host a conversation in your own community. I'd like to give a very special thank you to Josephine Gray, Michelle Pruder, Laurence Dubuc, Dale Eshelby for joining us for our panel discussion. Thank you to Mitchell and Sheila for joining us today. And yeah, please share the report widely. Please enjoy, grab a cup of tea. It's you know, a few pages long, but we did condense 900 people's comments into a fairly condensed report. So we hope you'll enjoy it, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.